Hello everyone, and welcome. Is this? Yep. Okay, just making sure everything's on the go. And yeah, so today, apologies, it's a little bit late. Took me a bit longer to sort these things than was initially intended, but trying something a little bit different today. What's tablet actually wakes up? Come on. There we go. So yeah, we will be moving on to gaming in a little bit, but first we are going to be having a little bit of chat fun with the books with the next video. Initially I was going to do this separately, but I thought, why not? Why not give a little bit of a taster on what you're going to hopefully see in some of the future streams as well. So, here we go. Just going to... Oh god, tablet, what are you doing? Stop. Tablet, what are you doing? Yeah. No. Let me view this. Thank you. Yay, right, we're working now. Take a quick sip. Yes, no mango today. Today we've got apple and kiwi Timbark drink, not sponsored. Right, here we go. The Elves. Fierce warriors, well-travelled and present in almost every part of Aphalas' history. Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Yes, this bit is for the YouTube benefit, so Twitch bear with me. Today, whilst this video will still be classed as a protector race video, it will still cover multiple sub-races, as the Elves have had perhaps the most complex of all races in terms of history throughout Aphalas. The Elves as a race throughout history have gone through various kinds of sub-races, different classifications and all the rest of it. When they started as four. You had the Moon Elves, Stone Elves, Sea Elves and Beast Elves. And then later on you had further developments like Dark Elf, Wood Elf and Ice Elf. When the Elves first emerged, they came into the world alongside the same time as the rest of the races covered in this series, emerging on both Galakaros and Shar. And if I just whittle the mouse around, I don't know if you'll be able to see it. Galakaros is the... I don't know if the scrolling in's going to work either, but probably won't. Galakaros is the isle next to the Twin Isles on the right, and Shar is, well, the Isle of the Lost. It's the big continent just near that. And whilst Shar would play host to the Erevan Elves, who would quickly develop into the Moon Elves of the realm of Erelin. I don't have it on this map. This map's a more updated one to when this all happened. Whilst on Galakaros, the Steothren emerged, though they quickly split into the three listed before. The Steolin, Stone Elves, the Steoglen, Beast Elves, and the Steodrain, Sea Elves. Who would also... And the Sea Elves would eventually be joined by some offshoot Moon Elves from Erelin, who would then take on the Sea Elf kind of... Well, it wouldn't be traits at first, it would be more like... They would integrate themselves into that society. Whilst for a long time the Elves were largely living in peace alongside the other races of Aphalas, it was actually the Beast Elves who would break the trend and become pretty much one of the first sort of races to, or sub-races to break off and start serving a darker power. They turned against their distant cousins on Gallicaros and would create the first brutal war that island specifically would ever play host and witness to. The Beast Elves quickly actually transformed into the Horde of Beasts. They got their name through a focus around the different beasts and wildlife throughout Aphalas, and the Horde of Beasts is when they almost went more nomadic, and with the assistance of Sea Elves who were actually aiding them, they actually brought over various creatures from the Alanase Savannah over on Okivrist, and alongside other beasts, and they would bring them over for the Beast Elves to essentially domesticate and tame. Excuse me. And this would cause a lot of problems for the Stone Elves. The actual conflicts that occurred, and I will be doing a future video more in depth at this conflict because it's quite a significant one, but the Stone Elves ended up getting aid from Goblins, the Trolls, even some Dracons came over in the form of enchanters, so they got, as well as more different creatures and beasts, so they actually got a lot of support and effort whilst the Beast Elves got backed up by some loyal Sea Elves to them, who they had more kind of paid off. They were more like mercenaries, alongside some half-ogres as well from the, if I remember correctly, it is from the Principality of Medeiros, some of the offshoots of them. And it turned into a very brutal war, and it was a war that the Stone Elves lost in the end, and it had further repercussions than that, but effectively the Stone Elves got almost completely wiped out by it. And whilst this was all going on, the Sea Elves had already largely left, aside from those mercenaries, and they had actually crossed over to Okivrist and started setting up their own land, which became the 4 colonies of the Sea Elves. The other 2 colonies sort of broke off and did their own sort of thing. They mainly kept mobile for a time. Whilst that actual conflict was obviously horrific for Aphalas with the loss of the Stone Elves, a force that could have been quite powerful in their aid and effort, the final effort of the Stone Elves, a final reciting of a prophecy, actually ended up in a massive devastation of the ranks of the Horde of Beasts and their allied Sea Elves. And this prevented them basically from having the strength to leave Gallicaros for a while and force them into hiding. Though together they would slowly form into the first of the Steoreth, the Dark Elves. During the corruption and fall of Nagrasak, more elves would swear to the Dark Elven ranks, mainly coming from the Moon Elves, especially after they swore the Daralothir Enekir, the kind of pledge of eternal servitude that they gave to Nagrasak. And the main force of the Moon Elves that actually went and joined them actually had been an offshoot cult for a while known as the Worshippers of the Dragon, named after the fact that Nagrasak could transform himself into basically a giant, great, dark, demonic dragon. And they started bowing to the darker arts and became more sort of twisted in some respects, although I would still argue that the Beast Elves were a bit more twisted than them because they ended up having exposure to Sinepia instead, who in Aphalas is effectively the source of pretty much all corruption. So, yeah, it's one of those things where, as bad as Necrosec is, Sinepia is way worse. And this ended up bringing this cult of moon elves at odds and an inevitable civil war with their own kin, the rest of the moon elves, who formed into the Shields of the Phoenix, named after Necrosec's sister Galeria, who again could transition into a phoenix. And also they stood by and fought alongside the father for a time, but also mainly Galeria. Eventually, though, the Shields of the Phoenix would be driven out of Shar, and they would end up actually getting given refuge from Galeria on Destinal, where they would later also be joined by an uprising of elves who had formed the worshippers of the dragon, but then became not really disillusioned, more like mortified by what their kin were doing. And they would conduct an uprising type war for a while through the woodlands and forests of Adalar. And I know from the distance you've got the map in at the moment you can't really see it, but on Shar, if you go down from the sort of deserty terrain, there's a collection of trees between Steorek and Kretanaroth, and that is essentially where Adalar is. It's almost like a central giant forest on Shar. And they would conduct there for a time, and it would end up with them, as well as the refuge that the others got on Destinal, being the Wood of Arakan. They kind of formed together to basically start deeming themselves and also being titled the Erelin, the Wood Elves. And they would eventually go on to form the realm of Erelgarth, which, if you oversee onto Destinal, is kind of... I need to work on zooming in this map for future reference and things, but it's the sort of darkened quadrant that's divided up by the river. That's the Erelgarth, and Arakan is slightly further to the southwest, but it's too small to really see from here. And these two lands would become the home of the Wood Elves for many, many, many years. And throughout these years, multiple times in these conflicts, you would see the Wood Elves and the Dark Elves on opposite sides of the battles. Not normally on the same battles, as, well, they existed on two different isles, so it was a bit challenging at points, but they did participate a lot in fighting their kin. The Dark Elves, though, were able to flourish quite well and form the realm of Steotha, and properly establish themselves, and ending up effectively becoming the main rivals for most of those years to the Ajati and the Forest Dwarves. The Ajati, who were... Oh no, it is there, I just moved it. The Sanctuary of the Ajati, which is like at the top kind of northwest of Shar, and then the Forest Dwarves, who lived in Adalar in the realm of Alaros. And yeah, most of the conflicts on Shar would be between those three, with some support from the demons from Nagrasak's Demesne. The Ogres at the south, they kind of did their own thing and had their own tasks a lot of the time, so them participating. It's one of those interesting things, like the Dark Elves and Sarakarth Ogres are meant to be allies, but they really did not get on well, and it was normally fairly rare on the mainstay of Aphalas to see Elf and Ogre fight. Whereas if you go over to on Archivorous, it became quite a common thing. And yeah, whilst the Wood Elves the Wood Elves ended up developing into a role alongside the Dracons of being the shepherds of basically humanity as it was growing up in Destinal, or the humans on Destinal were growing up and developing, whilst they were also protectors of Destinal, effectively, and the important key areas of it, like the temple lands and stuff like that. But despite this, and despite the Wood Elves entering into this role very early on, I'm going to turn myself down a little bit because I think I might have been being too loud. Whilst they did develop into this role, they weren't given the status of protector race like the Dracons, like the Forest Dwarves and all of that for a while. And part of this reason is because there were those among the protector races who did not trust them, the most notable of which being the Trolls. Although the Ajati kind of drifted in and out of trust of them as well. Which isn't helped by the fact that most of the Ajati were busy fighting Dark Elf most of the time. And for the longest time, pretty much, the only elves that existed on Aphalas were Wood, Dark, and Sea. And within all of this time, the Sea Elves had probably formed Steogris, the realm of the Four Colonies, and the other colonies had disappeared, and some had offshooted in, and others just kind of scattered around Aphalas doing all sorts of different things, explorers, traders, things like that. And it wouldn't actually be until Nagrasag made a bit of an error in judgment that a fourth Elven subrace would then develop. And it was when he sent a company of Dark Elves to the north of Arasin into the ice area, the northern ice of all of it. And whilst they were there, they encountered the aftermath of a battle. And there were various bodies of various different peoples there. There were some Kirindrek, there were demons, there were all sorts. Some steppe tribes. But in the middle of all of it was a child of a wyvern. And no one really knows why brought it to its fate. No one even knows how it even got there. But the price was the majority of the Dark Elves that got near it or tried to inspect it ended up getting overwhelmed by corruption, and it was Sinetvia's corruptive magic that had somehow found its way into this child beast thing, and it twisted their minds and bodies. It turned them ice cold and effectively into calculating architects and agents of Sinetvia's instructions and plans. And the Ice Elves, as they would now be known, would become the greatest threat, without a shadow of a doubt, to Arasin, through manipulation of the steppe tribes, creation of the Ice Rhino men, a sort of hybrid of the Ice Rhino kind of beasts that were common to Arasin and humans that they captured from the Fayoum, who are part of the mountain holdings. And they would end up bringing war to both the Ajati of Eregion and the Kirindrek of Arakirin, and they would become the priority focus to the point where they became such a grave threat that in one key event they attempted to take the Dragon of Darkness, Nisother, one of the most powerful creatures in all of Aphalas, and they attempted to corrupt him. And just the threat and the risk of this was enough for the Kirindrek mages to create the A-Gate barrier around Arasin, not so much to keep others out, but to keep the Ice Elves stuck in Arasin and pretty much trap them. And yeah, it took a lot to do, but it also made sure that most of Aphalas for a long time was safe from their threat. And the Arcane A-Gate barrier would remain up for a very, very long time. And all the while, the Ice Elves did various mechanisms, like they corrupted Kirindrek, they attempted to harness more of their magic, they worked in diplomacy to use the steppe tribes against one another, mounted forces up, they got some support occasionally from other forces. But it became such a threat that even Nagrasak, he sent a small force of demons into the steppe lands, but after that era with the Dog Elves, he very rarely sent anything to Arasin ever again. And yes, whilst all of this was going on Archiveris, like I said, the Steogris Sea Elves had formed and everything, and whilst they were the only really known peoples to actually be able to cross the Ruby Mist successfully, they mainly stuck to themselves, trading, explorers, very seafaring orientated focuses, although they did also aid in efforts against both the both the first demons and the wyverns when they were around. So the Labyrinth of Beasts and Naysares. Like all other peoples in the main Isles of Aphalas, so Destinal, the Twin Isles, and Shar and Galakaros. When the Crisis of Galakaros came about, the Dark Elves and the Wood Elves both ended up involved in it. And it was probably the only time in the history of Aphalas where those two people, where the two very distant, mutually hating kins worked together. And it wasn't direct working together, one was one side, one was the other, but they both ended up fighting against the common enemy on Galakaros. And it was actually in that crisis where Rake, the capital of the Dark Elves, was, I almost said Sea Elves there, was besieged about 4 times. In very quick succession, because the Crisis of Galakaros was not that many years. And Thoronsia, the person who my Twitch account is named after, was at the time the wielder of the Spear of Arakan, one of the key weapons that was capable of killing the likes of Galeria, Nagrasak, Sinepia, and all of that. And he participated in the final battle against Sinepia. And throughout his history of living, Thoronsia had actually duelled quite a few notable figures of note throughout Aphalas. Sinepia being one, Tonreef being another. And for those of you who are watching this but have not actually read the first book, Tonreef is one of the key sort of foes in the story. So, and his history goes back quite a long time as well. And yes, Thoronsia would go on to become one of the most significant figures of the time, and his legacy would last on for a lot longer. However, despite all of this, the Wood Elves' greatest loss was by far in the War of the Dwarves and Elves, where the Wood Elves actually ended up answering the call for aid by the Forest Dwarves to join them in the battles against the Dark Elves and the newly formed Desert Dwarves, who were offshoots of the Forest Dwarves led by Xeodan, who had been corrupted, ironically, by Tonreef in a lot of cases. Tonreef and Nagrisak connected and united. Though, despite their best efforts, this would be a conflict where the Wood Elves and Forest Dwarves would lose, and whilst they gave them a good run around and fought all over Shar, Steerek, Rayneath, the forests, even the Sands of Shar and the desert areas. So they fought all over the place in that conflict, and they would lose, and it would be a bad hit for them, especially with Nagrisak having mustered more demonic forces to then go in and strike. And from the Ajati video, which was the last one I did on this, yes, the Ajati actually had to step in and safeguard the Forest Dwarves and Wood Elves whilst they fled, because they were too few in number to be able to protect themselves from so many different forces. And whilst the Forest Dwarves fled to Lossakoth and then Naros, the Wood Elves did end up going to Destinor initially, but there were too few of them to really maintain the realm of Erelkarth, and they knew that. So they ended up staying at Arakan for a while and then moved to Naros. The only real reason they stayed at Arakan for so long was, at this point, House Telik had formed properly into one of the more recognised and stronger houses out of the Northern Realm. And this was the sort of time where they expanded east and kind of became the inheritors of what the Wood Elves had built. And once that had been properly established, the Wood Elves then did leave to Naros, and this is where Thoronsia's legacy properly comes in. Both Thoronsia and Trelvin, who was a mage of the Dragons of Daranthal and also one of their leaders at the time, one of the few Dragons to ever become leader and mage. And together they had formulated a plan to craft the haven city of Nesil Abeth in the underlands of northern Naros, so effectively a subterranean haven, to also give better defences to both the sleeping ancients and the Temple of Naros. But the crafting of this city provided a refuge for both the Forest Dwarves and the Wood Elves. And they remained there, pretty much, and waiting for the day that Aphalas would call upon them once more, but until then the Underlands would remain primarily sealed, with the Wood Elves and Forest Dwarves remaining within. Occasionally getting some support, but very, very rarely, because they made sure, because throughout time, most people forgot about their existence and thought they had just passed into legend. And so at this point, really the only two properly known peoples in all of Aphalas of the elves that were still alive were Dark Elf and Sea Elf, but, well, because the Ice Elves had been basically completely secluded to Arisen, and even the Sea Elves had been largely secluded, but because of the Ruby Mist and their ability to go through it, there were still peoples around Aphalas that still knew of them, like the trolls, the dragons, pretty much everyone who's on the Arachnylith archipelago. Because the Sea Elves did participate a lot in combating like the Sapphire pirates and things like that. Just a bit of little fun here. Some of the most notable wood elves throughout Aphalas' history are Thoronsier Thori, who was the leader of a specialised sort of assassin group of wood elves, but she then moved on and actually helped foil the Ice Elf plan against trying to corrupt Nissathir. You had Farathil and Faraki, two brothers who ended up inheriting the leadership whilst they were in hiding, and several others that played various roles throughout Aphalas' most dire times. I have, just as a side note away from this, I have started listing more Sea Elf characters, and I've got plans for them like Maron here and others. So, actually, can I just quickly find that? Come on. And there we go. Yeah, so a few of the prepared Sea Elf characters. You've got Arios Seablade, you've got Ekaroth, a Linnea Guard Prince, Linnea being the out of the 4 Sea Elf colonies is the furthest to the northeast. You've got Mayonair Sea Hunter, Arios Seablade, and Mayonair. God, that's going to be hard to pronounce. And I came up with these names. Their story is an interesting one, and I'm quite excited to be able to go around to actually properly writing that. But in terms of Ice Elves, you've got Laurentier and Lauroniac. One that, again, I can't really pronounce. And you've got there's all sorts, and it's like when you've had such a massive people who have spread so far, there's going to be so many characters that fill throughout the lore, and it's going to be fun to do. And outside of that, in terms of magic, the elves were fairly well versed. They weren't exactly that prominent per se. The Sea Elves had some affinity for it, being able to navigate through the Ruby Mist. And the Ice Elves were by far the most magically orientated, actually being led by a set of mages. And like the twisting of the corruptive magic, but Dark Elf, Wood Elf had some affinity, Dark Elf not a lot, but that was more due to a lack of being able to get anywhere to actually train it or harness it, as like one of the only the only 2 real main places where you could actually learn and harness the magic is the Marge Forest on Arakirin, which is fiercely guarded by the Kirin Drek, as well as like the Eyes of the Father and things like that. And the other place is the Narakorn Enhir, the 5 Towers of Enchanting that are square-facedly in the Kingdom of Daranthal, the Kingdom of the Dragons. So there is very few places in Aphalas where especially one orientated or connected towards Nagrasak or Senetvia, would be able to go and train properly, which is why a lot of the time their magic was far less refined, which is why the Ice Elves were almost such a massive threat, because they were some of the few who were able to. And yeah, like some other people, such as the Ogres, the Goblins, the Ogre Men, which are in there as well. No, not the Ogre Men, the half Ogres, because they're there. Half Ogres. Um, they ended up falling on all sides of Battle and Wars of Aphalas with various different allegiances. I mean, like I said, you had the sort of good side, the Wood Elf, the Stone Elf, then the worst side, the Dark Elf, the Beast Elf. They crossed over sometimes, and then the Sea Elves were pretty much everyone, but also in for themselves. It got complicated, and to be honest, I could have rewritten. To be honest, I could have probably rewritten Aphalas and just had it be just the elves and have it be quite chaotic even then. Um, and the one thing that was never without a doubt, though, is when the elves swore allegiance or became loyal to someone, they were fiercely loyal to them, whether it was good or evil. But yes, so this was first sort of live video of this, so this is going to be going on both the YouTube and it will be a part of this Friday live stream. I don't know if I'm going to do this for the other Protector Races ones. I think I'm going to wait for some feedback on that, see what people think. But for the YouTube front of things, please do comment, like, and subscribe and all that jazz. Please do check out the video descriptions on these videos as well as the others on the channel. If you would like to pick up a copy of the Defenders of Aphalas Book 1 or 2, or the Historical Fiction Standalone Code of Chivalry in ebook format. Or now, also, if you want to if you catch this on YouTube but want to check out the Twitch, that will be in the description as well. So, yes, until next time on the YouTube front, welcome to the Kingdom of Aphalas and the world of Felonmine books.